Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Habitat Representation in Protected Areas. The ABMI respectfully acknowledges that our work takes place on the territories of Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the Métis homeland, traditional and ancestral lands of First Nations and Métis peoples, whose histories, languages, and cultures are directly linked to the biodiversity that we monitor. We acknowledge and honor the traditional teachings of the lands that we work on and benefit from, and that reciprocal, meaningful, and respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples make our work possible. We are deeply grateful for their stewardship of these lands, and we are committed to supporting Indigenous-led monitoring programs while increasing our learning and understanding of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And now a bit about our presenter today. Brandon Allen is a senior terrestrial ecologist with the ABMI. His current focus is on leading the development and reporting of biodiversity and landscape-based indicators to support effective land use management in Alberta. So it's all yours, Brandon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Um, yeah, so today I'm going to be chatting about the science letter that was released a few weeks ago. Like Sonia said, it's assessing conservation through the lens of habitats. I do just want to acknowledge that though I'm the one presenting today, there was lots of people involved in this work, such as Janet Dooley, David Roberts, Emily Holden, Jacqueline Dennett, and Sydney Tony. So just a shout out to everybody involved in making all of this happen. So just a little bit of background. So thinking of conserved areas in Canada, we have protected, conserved, and what is known as other effective area-based conservation measures, other effective area-based conservation measures known as OECMs. And these are really effective tools for maintaining biodiversity across the landscape. So the figure on the right here is showing the current distribution of what is counted as a conserved, protected, or OECM area as of 2024 across Canada. And you can see that they track this based on terrestrial habitats as well as marine and protected areas. So this database is really just meant to track both at the national and subnational level of, again, the total amount of areas that are currently being protected. So kind of in general, the way that these databases are used right now, such as CPCAD, is that they are used to kind of track and monitor progress towards conservation targets. So one of the most recent conservation targets that's kind of in the spotlight these days is the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Target 3. In the Canada context, we just call this 30 by 30. And so this is the goal that Canada kind of agreed upon at that international stage, that they wanted to protect and conserve 30% of both terrestrial and marine land area or habitats across Canada. Recently, there was a Force of Nature strategy announced by the federal government, and this started to outline the kind of approach that they plan to take over the next several years of how they plan to meet that target. So you can see as of right now, in 2025, about 14% of terrestrial areas have some sort of conserved, protected, or OECM status. There's about 3% of new federal projects that are underway that they're hoping that will contribute. Another 3% is finalizing these projects. We have some private partnerships, and then a big chunk of the new areas being added are going to be these OECMs or other opportunities. So again, this is very ongoing, and these are very ambitious goals that the federal government has outlined. But putting it back in the Alberta context, a lot of these areas were established like well in the early history of Canada and weren't necessarily chosen to be ecologically represented of a bunch of different habitat types. So thinking back to, the Rocky Mountain National Park Complex in Alberta, which was established more than 100 years ago, as well as Wood Buffalo National Park Complex, there was lots of reasons for why groups wanted to establish these protected areas at the time. The mountains are very majestic and very scenic and fit the ideals of the time. They weren't necessarily choosing Banff National Park to become a protected area because it represented the ecological communities of the time or had an ecological representative balanced distribution of protected areas across the province. So even though we have a lot of mechanisms right now that are reporting on the total areas that are being conserved across Canada and in different subnational jurisdictions, it is really important to start to understand which habitat types are currently protected. So understanding, do we have a lot of fens that are represented by our current protected area networks? Is it grasslands? Is it bogs? And are there certain habitat types that may need to be prioritized if there is a desire to reach these conservation targets equally across habitat targets? So took a very general approach. This is a fairly straightforward analysis of intersecting some layers. So in general, what we did is we calculated the total area of terrestrial and wetland habitats currently conserved within Alberta. So again, taking the data that's found in CPCAD and all of the land cover inventories that are available within the province. We then assessed, are those habitat types over or underrepresented based on a variety of targets? So acknowledging that, there isn't one target out there in the world, and these targets are constantly changing. So just trying to get a sense of, across a broad range of targets, do we find certain habitat types are more or less represented in our park systems right now? We then compared how much area of each habitat type is currently conserved, disturbed, or remaining on the landscape. So trying to identify if there's patterns of, are there habitat types that haven't experienced much disturbance historically, but are also well protected, or habitat types also becoming very disturbed with low amounts of protections right now. And then lastly, we evaluated how much the remaining habitat would need to be conserved in order to meet those targets. So again, trying to understand the realities of things of can we even meet these targets? Are they achievable? And the steps that would need to be taken in order to get there. So yeah, very brief overview of some of the data sets that we use. So from the habitats, disturbance, and conserved areas perspective, we use two land cover inventories. So we use the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute's wetland inventory. So this is a remotely sensed-based product where we've been able to map the distribution of 5 wetland classes across Alberta. This is in alignment with the classification system from the provincial government as well, so the Alberta Wetland Classification System. So you can see on the right here the distribution of bogs, fens, marshes, swamps, and open water wetlands. We then also have internally what is called the ABMI backfill vegetation inventory. So for all of our upland habitat types, what the ABMI has done is we've worked together with a lot of our partners to harmonize land cover inventories across various parts of the province in order to kind of speak to the same types of land cover. So this involves a lot of collaboration with forestry partners using their AVI inventories, the Alberta vegetation inventories, as well as partners in all of the national parks where they provide their individual land cover inventories for Jasper, Banff, and Wood Buffalo National Parks. We then, of course, rely heavily on CPCAS, the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database, for understanding where these protected areas are in the province. And then we also use the ABMI Human Footprint Inventory. So this is an inventory that ABMI has maintained for many, many years now that gives a representation of where disturbance has occurred across the province. And so with this information, we can understand not only how much of a protected area has been conserved, but are there other types of disturbance activities that occur within that area? So things such as roads, or even thinking to the Banff National Park complex, where we do have city infrastructure that occurs within the region. So we have all of these human footprint inventories, these land cover inventories. This is really great. For comparing it to different targets, we looked at a bunch of different targets that are out there. We ended up settling on 3, knowing that, again, infinite number of choices available to us. So we first went with the ACHI Biodiversity Target 11. So this is one of the first international targets in kind of recent memory. And the goal was to conserve 17% of just habitats or the land in general. So it didn't make a distinction between terrestrial and marine habitats. This then eventually turned into that 30 by 30 target, so conserving 30% of terrestrial and 30% of marine habitats. And then we also took an approach looking at habitat-specific targets. So there is lots of work developing these indicators at the international stage. So one of them is called the Species Protection Index. And through that lens, what they decided was if a species has a really small or restricted range, we will want to set a higher target. So if it's only occupies, 10,000 square kilometers across the world, we might want to conserve all 100% of that area. Whereas if a species is widely distributed and occurs almost everywhere across the globe, we might only need to conserve a smaller percentage of it in order to be an effective conservation measure. So again, that was developed for a species concept, but we just applied the same general rule sets for habitats as well. So if it's a rare habitat, we had a higher target. If it is a really common habitat across the province, we had a much lower target. And then lastly, the other piece of the puzzle we had to deal with was defining baseline. So this is a really challenging thing and kind of an ongoing topic where if we set these targets in the context of, say, 2020 of wanting to conserve 30% of the remaining land base, that gives us a very different answer as if we had said we wanted to conserve 30% of the remaining land base in 2000 or going back to the 1900s. And so it's really important to define, what do we mean by the baseline target? Is it 30% of the entire land base? Is it what we think was there in a certain time point or year? And it's kind of easier for some habitat types and more challenging for others. So for terrestrial habitats, thinking of all of our wet or upland habitat classes, we infer a natural vegetation type prior to disturbance using the ABMI backfill vegetation inventory. So the way this works is, say you have a stand of spruce and a harvest area goes in there. We know prior to disturbance, it was likely a spruce stand. And we can use the general rule set for other disturbances as well. So if you put in a well pad in the middle of a deciduous stand, we infer then the reference date that well pad would have been deciduous. However, for wetland habitats, it's really challenging. So a lot of the disturbance types just erase that feature. So thinking of small prairie pothole wetlands in southern Alberta, we know that they were relatively common in the past, but it's really hard to figure out where they would have occurred because they've just been removed due to agriculture activities. So depending on the habitat type and depending on where we were in the province, we took a few different approaches. So specifically for wetlands in the green area, we distributed the disturbed area based on the area of wetlands. We know the forested area of the province is about 30% wetlands. So we took the disturbed area that occurred within wetlands. 30% of that then was distributed to wetland classes based on the current distribution. So it was a fairly simple rule set to figure out what we think was there. In the white area, though, so it's been estimated about 60 to 70% of wetland loss has occurred within the region. So we estimated a reference area assuming that about 65% of wetlands have been lost in the area, and then assigned that total area based on the distribution of observed wetland classes today. We know this isn't perfect, so again, there might have been biases in the types of wetlands that were disturbed due to human activities, but at least gives us a rough sense of what we think might have been there prior to disturbance. So now that we know what was, kind of this general approach we want to take, we can start figuring out what is currently protected in the province. So you're going to see a lot of figures like this. So anything in green, we're talking about these terrestrial upland systems. Anything in blue, we're talking about wetlands and more aquatic systems. So you can see as of 2022, fens are the most conserved by area habitat type within Alberta. So thanks to the Rocky Mountain Park National Complex, lots of fens are currently protected or fall under those OECM statuses. And that's followed by spruce stands, pine stands, and then we get into deciduous, where mixedwood, grass shrub, bogs, and marshes have relatively low amounts of total protected areas within the province as of 2022. So let's look at the representation then. So using these different targets, so we have that 17% target on the left, 30% target in the middle, and these habitat-specific targets on the right. We can see, are we meeting or exceeding them? So if we take that approach of a 17% target, we can see based on the total area of pine and spruce stands that is currently protected right now, we have well exceeded that target. So you can see we're more than 150%, close to 200% for those habitat types. And similar is true using that same target for fens, bogs, and open water, where we have conserved about 17%, a little bit more than that, of those habitat types of what we think was out there prior to any human footprint activities occurring within the province. However, the story does change as we change these targets. So, if we go up to a 30% target, you can see only spruce stands actually meet this. Pine is getting close, and same with fens. But again, it has shifted a little bit. And then if we switch to habitat-specific targets, we also see a reduction as well. So, very few, a very small percentage of marshes and swamps, mixed woods, and grass shrub habitats kind of fall under these current protection statuses right now, regardless of the target that you're comparing them to. And so we wanted to, again, put this in the context, how much is conserved, but what is also been disturbed across the landscape. And so these figures here, what we've done is we've scaled the total area for each habitat type into percentages. So this is the total percent area of those habitat types we think has existed on the landscape prior to any human activities. And you can break this down by what currently falls under these protected areas and OECM statuses, what is just considered as native on the landscape, so currently doesn't have any active human footprint on it, and then any areas that have historically been disturbed. So this does include a wide variety of land use activities. This can be your urban parks, this can be your roads, this can be your well pads, your open pit mines, harvest areas. So this is just anything that has had direct human alteration on the landscape. And we again see some really mixed stories. So looking at pine and spruce stands, so again, we have a large percentage of pine and spruce stands have conserved statuses, and there is a relatively large amount of remaining native and undisturbed areas on the landscape for those habitat types. Same is true for fens and bogs, where again, there's a little less conserved area compared to the terrestrial or upland counterparts. But again, there's a large amount of native remaining habitat on the landscape that just doesn't currently isn't currently considered right now as part of those protection statuses. However, switching to those habitat types that we've seen don't have a ton of conserved areas right now. They're often the same habitat types that have high amounts of disturbances historically. So thinking to our grass shrub habitat types, our mixedwood and our marshes, more than 50% of those habitat types have been disturbed, kind of since human activities have started within the province, and less than 10% of those areas or those habitat types have effective conserved or protection statuses right now. So it's kind of this unfortunate double-edged situation where it does seem like the areas that have historically been most disturbed also have the least amount of protections right now. But one of the things that I think is important to consider too is that, again, this is a very broad perspective of what is conserved. And a habitat is not a habitat. So thinking of pine and spruce stands, it does really matter where they are being conserved in the province. So the species that make up a pine stand, there's multiple species of pine, there's the old foliage birds that are using them, understory vegetation, there's the moss, there's the lichen. And those species that occur in the boreal are very different than those that occur in the Rocky Mountains or the Canadian Shield or the foothills. And so what you can see here is that really the amount of habitat type or these habitat types that are currently protected is being established again through the Rocky Mountain National Park Complex and the Wood Buffalo National Park Complex. So if we're thinking about, conserving pine stands in the foothills or spruce stands in the foothills, not a lot of those communities or habitat types have actually been conserved as well. So there's a lot of really interesting nuance and context you can dive into. So again, setting a single target doesn't give you the whole picture, and there's lots of weeds for us to explore. So lastly, we wanted to try and figure out, where are the gaps? So again, this really depends on your target. So that's why I explored a bunch of different targets. And so if we were accepting that the goal was to conserve 17% of all habitat types based on their historical distributions, within Alberta, we're fairly close to a lot of those targets. So we've met them for bogs and fens and open waters, pine and spruce stands as well. What we need to conserve, about 35 to 40% of the remaining grass and shrub areas or mixed woods within the province in order to meet those targets, but they seem relatively achievable if that was the target that was chosen. However, as we increase these targets, you can start to see that there might be more challenges. So if we wanted to conserve 30% of the remaining land base equally for each habitat type, that's more than 50% of the remaining native or natural mixed woods that exist in the landscape, and same with grass and shrub habitat types. And one of the really challenging things we saw with the habitat-specific targets is what we saw for marshes. So in this case, we would actually need to conserve more than 100% of the remaining marshes on the landscape if we wanted to meet that target. And so that starts to bring up these questions about, are these targets achievable? If we need to just implement conservation measures in terms of establishing that this counts as a conserved area, that's one challenge. Restoring marsh and other wetland habitat types is a very different challenge. So again, it's really nice to use a broad set of targets and understand, are these achievable across habitat types, and what are the potential gaps in terms of habitat representation across our protected systems? So that is a very quick rundown of kind of what we talked about in the science letter, but I do think it's important to kind of have a few caveats in mind as you're interpreting this. And first is just objectives really matter. So the goal of these 30 by 30 targets are for international targets. They were meant to be broad targets. They weren't designed to be representative of all habitat types. They're meant to be simple, easy to communicate tools to just help increase the amount of protected and conserved areas across Canada. So this isn't a critique of these targets saying like we're not meeting them or they're not doing exactly what they want. Like these are meant to be simple targets of just adding more protected areas. So they're doing what they're meant to do, but there's a lot of nuance in there that's worth diving into to understand what aspects of biodiversity are these protected areas conserving. And second, it's really important to think about the definitions. So the definitions for conservation areas and OECMs is continually under refinement. So what we're talking about here is really a representation of how we perceive Canada's land base and Alberta's land base to be protected, but these are actively ongoing conversations. So we do have rangelands that do contribute to biodiversity across the province. There are Indigenous protected areas that are actively contributing to maintaining biodiversity, but these are just currently not counted in the CPCAD database as of 2025 right now, or 2026 right now. So again, you could rerun this analysis in a few years, looking at the same time points, and get a slightly different result just because our understanding of what counts towards these protected areas is continually evolving. And lastly, there are just multiple approaches for defining a baseline year. So again, the conversations or the ability to meet targets does change if we're trying to conserve 30% of what we think existed on the land base prior to human activities versus if we're trying to conserve 30% of the land base as of 2026. Um, so it's important just to make sure we're really clear in our communication of what those baseline years mean when we're having conversations with stakeholders. So again, in summary, ecological representativeness in Alberta is really complicated. Some habitats are meeting or exceeding targets, depending on how you define those targets. So again, is it a 17%, 30%, or a habitat-based target? And the choice of those targets is really affecting our conclusions of what and how much of each habitat type is protected within Alberta. But again, it's really important to know what is currently protected. So again, we want to understand that the targets that were being set out for us are achievable, that they encompass a breadth of different ecosystem types, both at the subnational stage of Alberta as well as the national stage of Canada. And it helps provide an opportunity to prioritize where resources need to be to make sure that we do maintain biodiversity across a wide breadth of areas. So with that, I'm very happy to answer any questions folks might have.